Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 41. The Sword Lion. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we finished the story of Sulayman ibn Kutalmış, the founder of the Sultanate of Rum and the very first Roman Sultan. Sulayman had been an entrepreneurial and audacious border lord, a man who had set himself up in the northwest corner of Anatolia, on the gates of the Roman world and the very fringes of the Muslim world. And from there, he had negotiated, fought, and bullied his way into being a sultan. In a reckless bid to challenge Melik Shah for the leadership of the Turkmen, he had then ridden southeast and taken the great city of Antioch from its Byzantine duke, before ultimately being killed by his cousin Tutush. His story ended with his corpse tied to the back of a mule and sent through the gates of Aleppo. Melik Shah then marched into Antioch, took the ancient city for himself, and carted Sulayman's young sons back off to Esfahan. These two sons were Daud and Kılıç Arslan, whose name, of course, means the Sword Lion, and who will go down in history as one of the greatest sultans of Rum, and indeed, the man who will really create the Sultanate in many ways. But sitting here now in 1084, it sort of looks like the Sultanate of Rum is finished. The Sultan is dead, his sons are locked up in a prison in Esfahan, and Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya stands triumphant. At the time, it probably looked like the Sultanate of Rum was destined for the same fate as the erstwhile Nawakiya Beylik, to be swallowed up by either the Great Seljuk court itself or by its rivals in Anatolia, the Beylik of Çakabey, the Danishmends, and so on. But this is, of course, not what happened. And so today, we are going to dive into how the Sultanate of Rum survived against the odds, and how one of those men sitting in a jail cell in Esfahan, Kılıç Arslan, the Sword Lion, would, against all the odds, ultimately claim his birthright. Which, as we will see, was kind of a shocking thing to pull off, both in the sense that Kılıç Arslan was able to actually seize the throne, and that the Sultanate itself survived in his absence. Sitting in his jail cell in 1084, Kılıç Arslan could not have possibly known what awaited him and the state his father had founded. This, of course, leads again into the problem with our historians that I have mentioned before. Indeed, I think I've discussed this problem with the sources in every episode of this informal Season 5. The fact that our historians know what is going to happen and are heavily incentivized to make the rise of the Sultanate of Rum look inevitable and to present the Sultanate in its early years as the polity that it would later become. The supreme Turkish power in Anatolia, a centralized and organized state, firmly led by the line of Kutalmış. But this is not how things looked at the time, or what the state looked like at the time. This is both a projection back into the past of the realities of the present in which the historians were writing, and the product of royal propaganda. In reality, sitting there at the time, all we can say is that Sulayman had laid the foundation of a sultanate by uniting a swath of Anatolia stretching from Iznik to Cilicia. That he had begun building a state through taking over the existing Roman structures of administration and cooperating with the local Byzantine elites, and that he had done enough to successfully retain this proto-state's independence from the Great Seljuk court. But that is a far cry from a highly developed sultanate recognized by everyone as the preeminent Turkish power in Anatolia, and there could be no assurances at the time that this proto-state would survive. Okay, so what happened to the Sultanate upon the death of Sulayman and the victory of Melik Shah and Tutush? Of course, Sulayman's recently conquered territories in Antioch and Cilicia were taken over by Melik Shah and brought firmly under the control of the Great Seljuk Sultan. Indeed, it is interesting to note that it was Melik Shah himself, and not Tutush, who was the ultimate beneficiary of Tutush's victory. I think it goes to the power accumulated by the court of the Great Seljuk Sultans during Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya. This consolidation of power by the Great Seljuk Sultan in northern Syria and Cilicia effectively put an end to any hope of the few remaining Byzantine troops of retaking the region, and which news, when it reached Constantinople, contributed to Emperor Alexios appealing to the Pope in Rome and his Christian brethren in the West for aid. Pleas that would shortly launch a new type of holy war and bring a new invader to the Middle East, but this time from the West. But we'll get there soon enough. For now, Cilicia and northern Syria have been brought into Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya. But in Anatolia, the Sultanate endured, in a form. There was no longer a sultan, of course, as the only men who could possibly claim the title were in prison in Esfahan. Instead, in Iznik, the state was taken over by Ebu'l Kasım, the Turkish name rendered as Ebu'l Kasım in Ana Komnena's history. If you'll recall from last time, it had been Ebu'l Kasım to whom Sulayman had handed over control of Iznik when he rode off to Antioch. He had taken his sons Daud and Kılıç Arslan with him, likely because he hoped to make the lands of Syria his home base, from which he would then contest the rule of the empire with Melik Shah. Thus, he wanted his heirs close at hand. But this then totally backfired when he died, and his heirs were captured and packed off to a jail cell in Esfahan. And the result was Ebu'l Kasım essentially becoming a regent or a governor of the Sultanate. But of course, Ebu'l Kasım was not able to claim the title of Sultan, as he was not of the House of Seljuk. Ana Komnena calls him a satrap, an anachronistic reference to the officials of the Persian Empire sent to govern provinces. Ebu'l Kasım appears to have shared power with his brother, a Turkish lord who Ana Komnena calls Pulchases, and who Turkish tradition calls Ebu'l Ghazi Hasan Bey. The two brothers roughly split the administration of the young sultanate, Ebu'l Kasım taking Iznik and the lands of northwestern Anatolia, while his brother took Konya, Aksaray, and the sultanate's possessions in the south. However, it appears that Ebu'l Kasım remained the senior partner, and that his brother deferred to him and his sovereignty. And the situation that Ebu'l Kasım faced in Anatolia remained essentially what it was during the time of Sulayman's ascendancy: a patchwork of nascent and emerging beyliks. Meanwhile, both the imperial government in Constantinople and the court of the Great Seljuk Sultan in Esfahan exerted great and sometimes conflicting pressure on this extremely fluid political world. And it would be Ebu'l Kasım who would have to navigate the young Sultanate of Rum through these troubled waters. Indeed, as we will come to see, he will sort of end up being an unsung hero in maintaining the Sultanate's independence. A main reason why there even was a Sultanate of Rum for Kılıç Arslan to inherit. Ebu'l Kasım appears to have started his reign by basically tearing up Sulayman's peace treaty with Emperor Alexios. He sent raiding parties out across the land, striking at the Byzantine maritime possessions in violation of the treaty reached between Alexios and Sulayman. Ana Komnena writes, "The man was capable and intrepid, and would not be satisfied with what he had, so he sent forth foraging parties to lay waste to the whole of Bithynia and as far as Propontis." This was intolerable to Emperor Alexios, who, although he was unable to seriously challenge Turkish power on the plateau, could not abide Turkish raiding of the coasts so close to the capital. This was in part because of the frail state of the Byzantine military. Alexios had been defeated by Robert Guiscard in 1081, which had been a grievous blow to the Byzantine army and to his own reputation. Turkish raiding was therefore a very bad look at a sensitive time. And as we will discuss further next time, Alexios was therefore concerned with defending and retaking at least the coastlines of Anatolia, with the ultimate goal of using this as a base to reconquer the rest. So Alexios scraped together what forces he could, mostly Western European mercenary knights apparently, and put them under the command of someone whose loyalty was unquestioned, his childhood friend Tatikios. Now Tatikios was actually himself a Turk. He had been captured and enslaved in his youth, converted to Christianity, and then brought into the Komnenian house as a house slave. He had therefore basically been raised alongside Alexios, and had then served as a soldier under Alexios throughout the emperor's career. Tatikios was therefore a completely loyal and experienced general, and one who knew Turkish and likely had at least familiarity with Turkish customs. Indeed, I think that the existence of Tatikios and people like him, Turks in the service of the empire, is incredibly important to remember, just like the cooperation of the Roman elites and the Turkish beys. It's an important reminder that the relations between the Turks and the Byzantines were hardly black and white. Sometime in 1085, Tatikios led his army out of Constantinople and marched on Iznik. According to Ana Komnena, Tatikios came to the very gates of Iznik itself. As he began to draw his army up in front of the walls, Ebu'l Kasım ordered a sortie. But Tatikios was able to draw his Latin knights up in battle formation and countercharge the Turks. The Turks were then driven back into Iznik itself, but Tatikios was still forced to withdraw, ultimately pulling back to Izmit. Then Ebu'l Kasım was even able to send a force after him to engage Tatikios in battle as he retreated. Ana Komnena, of course, says that this resulted in a rout and a total victory for Tatikios, but there's a lot of reasons to doubt that. First, Izmit remained in Turkish hands, which doesn't seem like the sort of thing that would have happened if Ebu'l Kasım's forces had been defeated. And more importantly, Ebu'l Kasım advanced further after driving Tatikios out of the region. The raids on Byzantine territory intensified, and Ana Komnena even says that Ebu'l Kasım was obsessed with the desire of annexing the Roman Empire. Rather surprisingly, Ebu'l Kasım then even began to build a navy, a first for a Turkish state on this podcast, though as we will discuss next time, it was not actually the first Turkish navy. That honor would go to the rebel Turkish Roman general Chaka Bey, now ruling in Izmir. Traditionally, the Turks had of course been steppe riders, not seafarers. But in 1085 or 1086, Ebu'l Kasım captured a sea town on the Marmara named Chios. He put the local shipwrights to work and ordered the construction of what Komnena calls buccaneering vessels. His goal was to complement the land raiding of his Turkish nomads with a little bit of sea raiding. In order to forestall this, Alexios sent out a maritime force to attack the unfinished fleet, and he simultaneously sent Tatikios out again to attempt to defeat Ebu'l Kasım in the field. This time, the Byzantines had mixed success. the maritime mission was able to succeed in burning the unfinished or recently finished ships and thus forestall Turkish naval attacks in the Sea of Marmara. But Tatikios again could not really drive Ebu'l Kasım or the Turks from Bithynia. The reality was that the Roman state simply lacked the power to do that, even here, on the doorstep of the new Rome. So instead, Tatikios stayed in the field, putting pressure on Ebu'l Kasım in Iznik without ever really seeing great military results. What ultimately ended this stalemate and changed the relationship between Ebu'l Kasım and Constantinople was in fact an outside factor, or an inside factor depending on how you look at it. Because in 1086, while Tatikios was marching his army around Bithynia trying to inflict a defeat on Ebu'l Kasım, a great army appeared from the east. An army reportedly 50,000 strong had been dispatched by Melik Shah himself. The Great Sultan had placed the army under the leadership of a general named Borsuk. Though to be clear, the number of 50,000 men is likely an exaggeration. This army was to complete the victory of the Seljuk court and the line of Chahri over the Sultanate of Rum and the line of Kutalmış. To finish off this so-called sultanate and bring it firmly under the control of Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya. This army led by Borsuk appears to have been part of a larger political project by the court of the Great Seljuk Empire to consolidate power in Anatolia. As we will discuss next time, Ana Komnena also reports an official named Siyavush traveling to other beyliks and bearing orders from Esfahan to submit. It seems that after the fall of Sulayman and the consolidation of Seljuk power in northern Syria, the court in Esfahan was looking to bring these newly emerging beyliks in Anatolia to heel. And if you'll recall from our episode on the Seljuk collapse, this was also around the time that Melik Shah was marching east to fully incorporate the Karahanate Khanate into the empire, to force the ancient house of Afrasiyab to submit. And I think we need to see this expansion into Anatolia in these terms, as part of the Seljuk court's attempt to extend the power and the reach of Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya. Though I would note that this was not an attempt by Melik Shah and Nizam-ul-Mulk to conquer the Byzantine Empire or prosecute a jihad in Anatolia. It was instead an attempt to force the wild Turkmen and these border lord beys to submit. Indeed, Ana Komnena reports that the court in Esfahan reached out to Constantinople, seeking an alliance with the Roman Empire to bring their wayward vassals into line. She writes that Melik Shah's letter to her father, Emperor Alexios, said, in part, "If therefore thou art anxious for Ebu'l Kasım to be driven out of those countries, and to have Asia and even Antioch itself under thy rule, then send me thy daughter as a bride for my eldest son." That son, of course, was Berkyaruk. Seeing as the daughter in question was none other than Ana Komnena herself, she is of course quite dismissive of this, and devotes a paragraph celebrating that the marriage proposal was not accepted. But I think it does speak volumes to the importance Melik Shah and Nizam-ul-Mulk put on cementing their control over Anatolia, and the extent to which the relationship between the Muslim and Christian worlds in this new frontier zone of Anatolia was messy and gray, and not black and white. And this attempt by the court in Esfahan to gain control over Anatolia was the greatest threat to the now sultanless Sultanate of Rum. In order to maintain the independence of this young state, Ebu'l Kasım would have to resist the most powerful men in the world, the Great Seljuk Sultan Melik Shah and his Grand Vizier Nizam-ul-Mulk. The approach of this great army, led by Borsuk, of course caused Ebu'l Kasım to freak out. And he quickly calculated that he could not stand against the might of the Great Seljuk Sultan alone and by himself. Soon, Borsuk's army appeared before Iznik itself and put Ebu'l Kasım to siege. The army of the Great Seljuk Sultan besieged the entirety of the land walls of Iznik. And so, Ebu'l Kasım turned to Emperor Alexios and to Tatikios, pleading with them for aid. Ana Komnena relates, "Then, when the townspeople and Ebu'l Kasım himself saw that things had come to a distressful pass, and that they would be unable to hold out much longer, they sent message to the emperor, begging him to come to their aid, and saying that they preferred to be called his servants than yield to Prosuk, that is Borsuk." This decision must not have come lightly to Ebu'l Kasım. He had just spent the better part of 2 years in conflict with the Roman Empire. But he realized that the threat posed by the Great Seljuk court was far greater. The Romans were not capable of driving him out of Iznik or destroying this young sultanate. But Melik Shah and the Great Seljuk Empire? Yeah, they could totally wreck him. And so, even though it would mean sacrificing a measure of his independence from Constantinople, it was worth it if it would guarantee his independence from Esfahan. Emperor Alexios himself made a parallel calculation. He had messages now from both the Sultan Melik Shah, promising an alliance in exchange for the hand of his daughter, and Ebu'l Kasım, begging for aid against this existential threat. And put yourself in Alexios' shoes. The Sultanate of Rum, now under a sort of regency or governorship by Ebu'l Kasım, was a regional power. It caused him all manner of headaches. But the Great Seljuk Empire, the court in Esfahan, that was a potentially existential threat, one that he simply could not have on his doorstep. Especially as word was now beginning to trickle into Constantinople of Pecheneg unrest in the Balkans. Melik Shah was the most powerful man in the world, and as the lord of the House of Seljuk, maybe he could actually unite these squabbling Turkish beys. Ebu'l Kasım, the governor of a relatively small sultanate whose heirs were in prison, could never hope to do that. And so, Alexios decided better Ebu'l Kasım than Melik Shah. And in helping the Sultanate of Rum and its governor survive, he could maybe extract some concessions. Thus, Emperor Alexios sent an army out to save Ebu'l Kasım and the Sultanate of Rum. A Byzantine army left Constantinople and marched into Bithynia, arriving through the mountains at a small town called St. George on the north shore of the Lake of Iznik. By this point, Ebu'l Kasım and the Turks in Iznik had been besieged by Borsuk for 3 months. But the Roman army apparently refused to march on the city itself out of fear of the armies of the Great Seljuk Sultan commanded by Borsuk. Nevertheless, seeing the arrival of these Roman reinforcements and hearing of the simultaneous approach of Tatikios, Borsuk must have realized that Ebu'l Kasım had cut a deal with Constantinople. Borsuk determined that he could not take Iznik, and so he lifted the siege and withdrew back to the east. The army of the Great Seljuk Sultan left Anatolia, and thus left the Sultanate of Rum alive. Melik Shah's hope of destroying his late cousin's state, of swallowing the Sultanate of Rum as he had swallowed the Nawakiya Beylik and northern Syria, were now dashed. The Roman Empire had saved the Sultanate of Rum. With Borsuk's army gone, the Roman armies pulled back to Constantinople. Ebu'l Kasım himself soon received an invitation from his savior, Emperor Alexios Komnenos. He was invited to visit the imperial city and discuss the terms of their new arrangement. There, the two sovereigns agreed to a peace treaty, essentially reconfirming the deal that Sulayman had earlier reached with Alexios, but now with larger tribute payments and gifts from the empire to the Sultanate. And as a side note, the timing of this visit is actually a bit unclear. Anna Komnena's history is sort of hazy on the details, and she implies that this visit took place either before Borsuk's attack or while he was besieging İznik. But many historians think that this is not correct, and I myself find that timing a little bit suspect. Regardless of the timing of the visit, though, she writes that Ebu'l Kasım lived it up in Constantinople, being graciously hosted by the emperor. She says, "To Ebu'l Kasım, the emperor gave money every day and was profuse in his invitations to him to come to the baths, or horse races, or the chase, and further, to view the monuments up the high roads. Moreover, he gave orders to the charioteers to prepare an equestrian display in his honor in the theater which Constantine the Great built long ago." And Emperor Alexios gave a further great honor to Ebu'l Kasım. He bestowed upon him the title of Sebastos, the Greek version of the Latin Augustus. The title, traditionally borne by Roman emperors ever since the first emperor, Octavian, who claimed the title upon seizing power over 1,000 years earlier. Now, it was a title borne only by Byzantine aristocrats related to the emperor himself. Ebu'l Kasım was the first Turk and the first Muslim to bear this title, a sign of his new closeness to the emperor. Indeed, it seems that Ebu'l Kasım was becoming increasingly enamored with the Roman state, connected to what Anna Komnena says was his obsession with the desire of annexing the Roman Empire. And I think we need to see this as part and parcel of the state-building project of the Sultanate of Rum. Unlike the Great Seljuk Empire, which was created by laying Turkish structures on top of Perso-Islamic state structures, the Sultanate of Rum will be built through a fusion of Roman, Perso-Islamic, and Turkish elements of government. And the underlying, continuing apparatus of the Roman state was perhaps the most important of all of these in some ways. It formed the infrastructure of the Sultanate. The Sultanate, in essence, took over the local Roman administration from the top down. And this bearing of Roman titles and enamorment with the Roman state and the Roman imperial tradition would continue to inform the Sultanate. Indeed, I think that this really is the most important legacy of the rule of Ebu'l Kasım, aside from his maintaining the independence of the state. That's clearly number one. His acculturation to the culture and ideology of the Roman Empire, the titles, structures of government, and symbols of power. What changed during his rule was not really the territories controlled by the Sultanate, but rather the relationship between the Sultanate and the imperial government in Constantinople. The association of the Turkish ruler with the structures, symbols, and ideology of the Byzantine state. This was a way to legitimize this new sultanate in both the eyes of its Christian subjects and in the eyes of other Turks. And this will be something that will continue forward as the sultanate really establishes itself. To me, this is one of the most critical things to understand about the Sultanate of Rum, that it was an inheritor of the Roman imperial tradition. This is particularly interesting and important because so much of the official history by both Byzantine and Muslim historians presents the Sultanate and the Empire, and indeed the Turks and the Romans, as implacable enemies, coming from two wholly alien and completely different worlds. This started even at the time, and it has continued to come down to us in the present day. At its worst, it devolves into neo-crusader or neo-jihadist propaganda, the crescent versus the cross, a black and white struggle of strangers and implacable enemies, an irreconcilable and unending war between Muslims and Christians, Turks and Greeks, East and West, going back centuries. But this is emphatically not correct. As we have seen, and as we will continue to see, reality was far, far messier. The border between the Turkish and Roman worlds was less like a hard land border and more like an estuary, the place where saltwater and freshwater meet, flow back and forth, and mingle together. Both sides deeply influenced and infused each other. From Turkish beys building states in cooperation with local Christians, to Turkish Roman generals like Tatikios and Chaka Bey, to Turks bearing imperial titles, to Greeks serving Turkish sultans. And this mixing and melding will continue, and it will deepen going forward. In fact, it's going to be a real theme of this show. The Sultanate of Rum, and indeed all Turkish states going forward, including, by the way, the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey, will be just as much inheritors of the Roman tradition as inheritors of Turkish and Perso-Islamic traditions. Ebu'l Kasım eventually returned back to İznik sometime in late 1086 or early 1087, bearing with him his new Roman title of Sebastos. He was now, if not a vassal of the Roman emperor, a key ally. Yet despite this alliance, it does seem that Emperor Alexios continued to play his own game. Ana Komnena mentions that even while Ebu'l Kasım was visiting Constantinople, her father began constructing fortresses around Izmit, still a possession of the Sultanate. Alexios desperately wanted to retake this ancient city, which was less than a day's ride from his capital, and was key to controlling the absolutely critical Gulf of Izmit. In 1090, he would even send a force of 500 Frankish knights to the city to retake it from Ebu'l Kasım. And Anna also mentions Alexios fielding requests from other beys, hoping to convince him to turn on Ebu'l Kasım. Ultimately, though, even given his attempts to retake Izmit, Alexios did not really turn on Ebu'l Kasım. The deal that Alexios had reached with Ebu'l Kasım got him basically everything he needed. Trying to remove Ebu'l Kasım would just cause problems, and might result in a more powerful and less agreeable bey coming to power in İznik. And as we will discuss next time, Alexios was simultaneously dealing with other troublesome Turkish beys, and was likely wary of upending the situation in İznik. And then, the outbreak of a great war with the Pechenegs in the Balkans in 1087 further pulled his attention away from Anatolia. So Ebu'l Kasım continued to rule in İznik, indeed, likely strengthening the Sultanate of Rum over his fellow beys. The end came for Ebu'l Kasım in 1092, just as Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya reached its very end. And it came not from the Romans, but from what had always been the real enemy of the Sultanate of Rum, the court of the Great Seljuk Empire. According to Ana Komnena, whose account we should take with a grain of salt, in 1092 Ebu'l Kasım set out to pay homage to the court. Likely, after realizing that the Sultanate of Rum really could not be destroyed or Ebu'l Kasım removed from power, the vassal relationship between the Great Seljuk court and the polity based in İznik had been restored. As we discussed in our non-narrative episode on the state in the Great Seljuk Empire, this would have been totally normal. The Seljuk state was defined by constant negotiation among the various power centers, and after a conflict or war between these power centers, a new arrangement would be reached and things would then just continue on. But it seems that yet again, tension was rising between İznik and Esfahan, potentially connected to the growing tension between Melik Shah and Nizamul Mulk. Ebu'l Kasım left his brother Ebu'l Ghazi Hasan Bey, who, if you recall, was the one in charge of Konya and Cappadocia, in charge of İznik and the administration of the Sultanate in his absence. Ana Komnena says, Ebu'l Kasım loaded as much gold as they could carry on 15 mules and set off to see the Sultan of Persia. But reportedly, when he came to where Melik Shah was encamped, the Great Seljuk Sultan refused to even see him. He was delayed for months, far longer than he had expected, and never granted an audience. Finally, as he set out to return to Anatolia, he was seized by agents of Melik Shah. Komnena reports, "These took him prisoner, threw a noose woven of bowstrings around his neck, and strangled him." That, at least, does ring true. Strangulation by bowstring was the preferred Turkish method of execution for nobility, a tradition that dated all the way back to the days of the first Turkish Khanate, when Tengri forbade the spilling of the royal blood of the Ashina clan. And so passed Ebu'l Kasım, a Turkish Sebastos, a Turk bearing a Roman title, killed in the manner of a Turkish Khan. What can we say about Ebu'l Kasım? He hasn't been with us for too long, but his reign was nevertheless of great importance. Even though he never claimed the title of Sultan, he did safeguard and steward the Sultanate. He entrenched its power in Anatolia and continued the development of the state, the melding of Turkish and Roman structures of government, and creating a state out of the Byzantine infrastructure he took over. This legacy would be continued and built upon by his successors. But most importantly of all, he maintained the independence of the Sultanate of Rum from the Great Seljuk Empire. He kept the state whole, and he stopped Melik Shah and Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya from swallowing up the young Sultanate of Rum. And I think that even if he was not a sultan, Ebu'l Kasım deserves a place of honor in the list of the rulers of the Sultanate of Rum. So now Ebu'l Kasım lies dead, and his brother Ebu'l Hasan Bey is running the show in Iznik. Ana Komnena reports that in Ebu'l Kasım's absence, her father Alexios had tried to convince Ebu'l Hasan Bey to turn the city over to him, but that Ebu'l Hasan Bey demurred. He played for time, waiting for the return of his brother. When news reached Iznik of the fate of Ebu'l Kasım, Ebu'l Hasan Bey must have thought that this was his chance to become the ruler of Iznik for good, that he would succeed his brother, be recognized by the emperor and the sultan, and that the rule of the political entity in Iznik would pass to his family for good. But it was not to be, because, if you will recall, Ebu'l Kasım was not the only important Seljuk political leader to die in 1092. In October 1092, Nizam-ul-Mulk fell under the blade of an Ismaili assassin, likely with the connivance of Melik Shah. And then, mere weeks later, Melik Shah himself met his end at the hands of an assassin sent by the Caliph. Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya came crashing down as the Great Seljuk Empire descended into civil war. And it was in the chaos of this civil war that the next Roman Sultan would come to power. The man currently sitting in a jail cell in Esfahan, Kılıç Arslan, the son of Sulayman, the Sword Lion. Now, if you recall from our episode on the Seljuk collapse, after the death of Melik Shah, his wife Terken Khatun, the princess of the House of Afrasiyab, initially consolidated power in Baghdad in the name of her young and sickly son Mahmud. She then ordered the arrest of her son's main rival, Melik Shah's elder son Berkyaruk, who we saw this episode being promised to Ana Komnena. Berkyaruk was of course the favored successor of the late Nizam-ul-Mulk. Berkyaruk was thereupon imprisoned in Esfahan in the last days of November 1092. Esfahan was of course the de facto capital of Melik Shah's empire, and it also happened to hold other prisoners who were princes of the House of Seljuk, namely Kılıç Arslan and his brother Daud. Berkyaruk joined them in the jails of Esfahan, until he was shortly sprung from jail by the Nizamiya Turkmen and other old partisans of the assassinated Nizam-ul-Mulk. And it seems likely that it was in this confusion that Kılıç Arslan and Daud managed to break out of jail. Some sources say that the proximate cause was a quarrel among their jailers that the two brothers managed to exploit. Others say that they were ordered released by Berkyaruk supporters or escaped in the confusion at the jail as the Nizamiyya troops freed Berkyaruk. Regardless of the details, it was in this confusion, either during Berkyaruk's own jailbreak or else, as supporters of Berkyaruk and Terkan Khatun vied for control of the city, that the two brothers, the sons of Sulayman, made their escape. Sprung from jail, Kılıç Arslan and Daud commandeered some horses and began racing west as fast as they could. As the Great Seljuk Empire descended into civil war behind them, they made straight for the capital of their late father's young sultanate, on the fringes of the Muslim world and right on the doorstep of the new Rome. And so it was that at the very end of 1092, Kılıç Arslan returned to İznik. It had been 8 long years of captivity since he and his brother had seen the city that had served as the capital of their father's sultanate. We know frustratingly little about how Kılıç Arslan actually seized power once he and his brother Daud finally made it back to İznik. Ana Komnena writes that the brothers quickly made their way to Nicaea, that is İznik, where the inhabitants gave them an ovation and received them with greatest joy, and Pulchases, that is Ebu'l Hasan Bey, willingly handed Nicaea over to them as being their rightful inheritance, and the elder of the two, Kılıç Arslan, that is Kılıç Arslan, by name, was elected sultan. Now it is clear that Ana Komnena is oversimplifying or making some errors here. For one thing, she's clearly imposing on the Sultanate the Roman model of emperors being declared or acclaimed by their followers or the soldiers. But that's not really how sultans work. Sultans, theoretically, need to have the approval of the caliph to use the title, and even when they don't, it's more about them claiming the title as a divine grant. And it does seem that Komnena is being a bit scant on the details, which is totally forgivable as she was not there and had limited insight into the Turkish political world. But there are a couple of reasons to think that Kılıç Arslan was able to seize power in İznik extremely quickly. Firstly, the Muslim historians don't mention any great war or struggle in his seizure of power. They are, in fact, totally silent on the manner of his arrival in İznik, forcing us to rely entirely on Ana Komnena. But more importantly, as a prince of the House of Seljuk, Kılıç Arslan had a clear advantage over Ebu'l Hasan Bey. As we've already seen in the rebellion of Şöklü Bey, and in the ability of Sulayman to bully his way to the top of the pyramid, the tribes saw the House of Seljuk as legitimate rulers, and therefore as a unifying force. The House of Seljuk was also seen as legitimate by the Roman state, and likely by the Byzantine elites living in the Beylik due to the recognition by the emperor. Therefore, the local Turkish potentates and the local Byzantine administrative elites would have seen having a Seljuk prince at the top as greatly advantageous, and as more legitimate than rule by a nobody like Ebu'l Hasan Bey. And thus, Kılıç Arslan was able to quickly depose Ebu'l Hasan Bey and take over his birthright, to become the second Sultan of Rum. Based on a couple of sparse references in Ana Komnena's history, it does seem like Kılıç Arslan allied with other Turkish elites to depose Ebu'l Hasan Bey. Komnena writes that Ebu'l Hasan Bey was deposed from his post and that a Turkish leader named Muhammad was appointed as what she calls arch-satrap, an indication that Kılıç Arslan shook up the internal leadership of the Sultanate, raising up those who helped him seize power. Daud, for his part, was sent off to rule as his brother's deputy in Konya. But Kılıç Arslan did more than just shake up the pecking order in the Sultanate. Ana Komnena writes that he sent for the wives and the children of the men then staying in Nicaea and bade them live there, and made this city the dwelling place, as one might say, of the sultans. This is an extremely interesting line, as it implies that the original Turkish settlement in Iznik during the days of Sulayman and even Ebu'l Kasım was limited to, in essence, a Turkish military garrison. This is in line with what we know about how the beyliks formed. Turkish soldiers moving into the cities of the Roman Empire and taking over the role vacated by the now gone Roman soldiers. The settlement of their wives and family in the city was part of establishing a longer, more permanent Turkish rule. Not just military rule and resource extraction, but actual real government. It was also probably part of how Kılıç Arslan seized power, a concession to the Turkish soldiers and elites. Thus, İznik began to transform into a residential Turkish city, an actual capital of an actual sultanate. Daud, meanwhile, undertook the same efforts in Konya, inviting in the families of the Turkish garrison and establishing a permanent Turkish residential presence in the city. And this city was, of course, destined to be the next capital of the Sultanate of Rum. It was probably around this time that several of the churches in both İznik and Konya were transformed into mosques, and at least some of the estates and palaces of the Byzantine elites were turned into residences for the new Turkish elites. The foundations of the Sultanate of Rum, laid by Sulayman and Ebu'l Kasım, were now being built upon. As the Great Seljuk Empire fell into civil war, in Anatolia, the longest-lived of its successor states was now, finally, starting to come into its own, and the Turkification of Anatolia had begun. Thus began the reign of Kılıç Arslan I, the man who will really build the Sultanate of Rum, and who will oversee both some of its greatest victories as well as its greatest defeats. And next time, we will catch up with some of the other beyliks, and we will also continue the story of Kılıç Arslan as he expands the power of his sultanate and continues to build the state. But also, as the power and permanence of Turkish rule in Anatolia makes Emperor Alexios Komnenos think about calling for aid from the West.